Hey, what's up, guys? Tom here, and just wanted to do a quick video, on diet and health and well-being. Probably some of the boring topics, that people, don't want to discuss or have no care to discuss. We kind of treat that as a private facet of our lives, I guess. We really don't want to too much get into what we eat or, have others dictate, what we put into our bodies and our systems. We kind of treat that as a personal matter in our lives, and I kind of get that to a degree. And but it's also important that we do get information from others based on their experiences, going through their journey of health and fitness, understanding what may have worked for them, what doesn't work, you know. And I do agree that everybody's body is different, but usually there's a general consensus that there are foods, that no matter who you are, if you eat, they're going to be beneficial to you. They're going to have some type of, you know, benefit at the end of the day. You know, that's, beneficial to your longevity, to your mental health, your physical well-being, just everything, you know. So like I said, even though we kind of treat that as a private aspect of our lives, there's nothing wrong with hearing information from other people. And I just had to lay that out because I am aware that a lot of us get defensive when people start to tell us, well, you should be eating that, you should be eating this. And I do agree, it's a way to say things to people. You don't want to come off egotistical or like a tyrant, kind of, storming down on what people are eating at the moment, and making them feel bad for their decisions. What I've come to learn is that a lot of us really aren't educated as far as the foods we're eating, the impact that it has on our health, the things that we can eat to make our lives better, put us in a better mood, you know, has some behavioral effect on us because food does, impact our behavior. If you see a person that gorges a lot of junk food, a lot of sugar, a lot of sodium, usually those people aren't walking around the happiest of people versus someone, that's probably on a specialized diet. They may have a better mood, and that's not to say that's all across the board for people who choose to eat like that, but I think there's enough evidence out there to say that, people who usually eat better, have a better cognitive function, they have a better behavior, outlook, personality, you know, even aesthetic look. I don't too much pay, attention to the physical aspect, but, that has a lot to do as well with what you're putting in your body. But the reason I'm saying all of that is because I just want to hit home as to what I notice is that going to a lot of events, in the community, especially with my community, African Americans, black people, you know, and even outside of my community, I'm seeing that a lot of the foods that are served, they're not healthy at all. You know, Usually you'll have, this pizza which is loaded with, sodium and sugar and all types of unhealthy, additives, ingredients. You'll have these chips, potato chips, which are fried, high in trans fat, high in sodium. A lot of people, they don't even bother to read the ingredients label. I've made it my personal objective that anytime I pick up an item that probably I'm trying out for the first time, I make sure I flip that over and start reading the ingredients. And one thing I've learned is that if there's more ingredients in that food than you can count on one hand or two hands, you may want to think twice about ingesting that, putting that in your body. When we actually eat something from nature, there doesn't have to be an ingredient label. There's no 50, different additives or chemicals or whatsoever that's in that food. It comes straight from the earth. It's one simple, food ingredient, and science has proven that a lot of the foods, they have multiple benefits, So that's why I tend to make it a habit to read everything. For instance, I don't just eat any type of bread. Usually I like to eat whole wheat, bread that's been unbleached, doesn't have sugar in it, not high in sodium, because I understand how these things have an effect on my body. And like I said, it can be a personal agenda at times. Like I said, what works for one person doesn't work for everybody. Some people, they can ingest gluten, other people they can't, you know. But back to my point of a lot of these events that we go to out in the community, whether it be family events, social gatherings, whether it's an event for the school, for the kids, and they're serving food. Yesterday I went to a focus group at a law firm, and they told us they would be serving, breakfast, and lunch. So I'm just like, hey, I'm gonna kind of skip over my regular breakfast, which I kind of eat on a regular basis. I eat the same thing just about, and I'm just gonna wait till I get there to see what they're serving. And of course, what they had was nothing I actually eat, cookies, cake, sodas, and this is 10:30 in the morning. They were serving Coca-Colas, chocolate cake, potato chips. The only thing I would probably be lenient on that they had was some sub sandwiches. But even with that, I'm so particular with my diet. I'm actually a vegetarian. And that just applies to me. That's not to knock anyone else over the head, make anyone else feel bad that they eat meat. But me specifically, I'm vegetarian. So unfortunately, I couldn't eat anything that was there. And I do take that back. They did have a serving of strawberries, which was, the smallest platter on the table. There were barely any strawberries. So that's all I could eat at the time. And luckily, I've done intermittent fasting here and there. So it's not like I was starving anything. I can control my appetite. I can control, my hunger to a degree. So it's not like I went there starving, but I was kind of disappointed. I thought I was going to, actually be eating something, that was healthy, beneficial. And just not that scenario. Just like I said, every function I go to, there's always this, just excess junk food that's being served. And I don't think a lot of us as people were forced to understand what we're eating and understand the impact that certain foods has on our body. And I'm not here to act like an expert or a professional. Like I said, I delve into a lot of scientific articles. I like to look into certain foods, see what the ingredients are, see what benefits they have on you, because I'm 37 years old and I'm just at the point in life to where I want to know what I'm putting in my body, what it's actually doing, what impact is it having. Like I said, especially with my community, where these chronic diseases are at an all-time high, hypertension, high blood pressure, obesity, heart diseases. And I feel like a lot of people think that it's just a matter of, bad luck that they caught these diseases, not understanding that the choices that they've made for so many years is what led them down the path, of, getting these diseases, getting these illnesses. And that's not the only factor of the food. It may have been genetic, it could have been environmental. But at the end of the day, if we understand food can heal, we can also understand that food can kill. So I'm not going to call myself a Christian or anything, or a religious person, but I do believe when the Bible says that your body is a temple, and I believe that you should treat it that way. Your body is a temple for the Spirit of the Most High to come through and manifest, and your body is also a temple as far as what you put into it, what you do to it every day, how you train your body. A lot of people, they focus on the physical fitness aspect, but their spirit is not intact. They focus on the physical aspect, make sure they have the muscles and everything, hitting the gym hard, but they still tend to eat junk food here and there. And you can always tell. I've gotten to the point where it doesn't matter how much someone is in the gym, you can tell if their diet is off, because what I know now is that, and just to give a percentage, it's probably, at this point I would say it's probably 90% diet that gives you the look that you have when it comes to your physical fitness. You know, for instance, if you're really toned and sculpted and cut up, basically, I can tell, okay, that person is highly focused in the kitchen. Their meals are prepared. They're eating foods that's beneficial to them across a wide sphere, you know, of benefits. You know, they're not just saying, oh, well, I went to the gym for an hour or two today, and you know, I can go eat this Snicker bar, I can go eat this honey bun. No, I can tell when someone's being consistent in and outside of the gym. And a lot of people get tricked by that. You know, they think, well, even though I ate what I ate, I'll just go to the gym and do like an hour of cardio and burn it right back off. But what you see with these people is that they're going to go right back out and still ingest something unhealthy. And they're going to be back in that cycle of they've actually trained their brain to feel guilty about it, to say, hey, I'm just going to go in the gym and do this over excessive workout, you know, burn myself out just to burn those calories off that I took in. You know, so, you know, I don't blame people. Like I said, I'm not trying to swarm down on someone and say, hey, you're stupid, you're ignorant, you know, you're dumb, basically. I'm just saying that I don't think a lot of people have been trained to correlate the effects that foods has on their internal function at all. I think some of us have heard it, but we don't know on a personal level how that works. You know, I've seen if certain things I eat in the morning, is it going to power me through the day, or is it going to have me in a muddled, you know, psychological state? You know, is what I eat at night, you know, is it going to take a long time to digest? Is it going to impact my sleep? Is it going to have an adverse effect on my attitude, you know, my behavior whatsoever? I've understood these things, and I've come to learn them because I've put them into practice. I've actually experimented with myself. And that's what you have to do. You have to be able to look at your body as this big experiment, you know, what I've come to realize, because we're living in a body, but we still don't understand the full potential of our actual bodies, or the heights we can take our bodies to. And you can't take your body to the next point of evolution or, you know, greatness if you're filling it up with, you know, bad products. You know, a lot of us, we have these good cars, these nice expensive cars that we drive, and we're not going to go to the gas station and put the lowest grade of fuel, you know, in that tank. We're going to choose the highest grade because we want that engine to last. We want that car to last as long as possible because of, more than likely, the price that we paid for it. But yet we won't put that same effort or energy into our own bodies. You know, so like I said, I'm not gonna slam down on people, but I do think a lot of people need to start educating themselves about the impact that food has on them, and that humanity as a whole can start to see that we just can't keep going down the cycle that we're on, you know, just eating just high content sodium, sugar. You know, sugar is the most addictive, close to, you know, cocaine, you know, product that you can put in the food. And for anyone like me who pays attention to these labels, when you, like I said, I'm 36, I still consider myself young, but when I was growing up, I remember turning over a soda can, and it was never that much sugar in the soda. It's almost like 2 or 3 times more the sugar content in a soda now than it was back in, you know, probably in the early late 90s. And I guess that they've come to understood, in order to make people more addicted, you know, to buy these products, you know, to keep ourselves high, we have to add more additives. We have to make this stuff more addictive. So, like I said earlier, you have to treat your body like an experiment, because these industries out here, they look at you as an experiment. You know, they actually do study groups, focus groups, to determine, what content of a additive people are most willing to try, willing to put into their bodies, most willing to buy. And that's what they sell on the shelves, unfortunately. Things that people are most addicted to. Because it kind of irks me that, let's say I go out to a restaurant and order something. It's grown adults in the restaurant. They're asking the restaurant to take off the vegetable. they ask the staff to keep the vegetables separate or completely take them off of the plate. They don't want anything to do with the vegetables. The most healthiest thing that you could probably put in your body in that restaurant, but you're telling them that you don't want that. I'm hearing grown people complain about, I don't like onions. I don't like just any type of vegetable on my platter at all. And I just find that, like I said, I don't want to judge people or anything, but those are just people I would know that I don't want to hang around. I don't want to be around, because if they make a conscious choice that they're not willing to take in something that's going to benefit their body in the long run, probably help with their digestive system, something like onions that has so many benefits for your skin, I believe it's antibacterial. It helps on so many levels. And someone who doesn't want to put vegetables into their body, that kind of shows me the mentality that you have about just about anything else in your life, So I think humanity just needs to get to a point where we understand that, these industries, these food companies are taking advantage of us. They're killing us for a profit. And that we need to take more effort to educate ourselves as far as, the foods that we're putting into our bodies. I shouldn't have to go to different events and whatnot, and all that's being served is, just sugar, soda. Because what I'll never understand either is that, I'm an early riser and I have to get to work early sometimes. And as soon as I get into the office, it can be at 6 a.m. in the morning, 7. A lot of people probably get in at 8:30. I'm hearing soda cans crack open. It's also almost like, how can the first thing you put in your body be a Coca-Cola that when you turn over the can, I believe it has about almost 70% sugar content in there of your daily value, more than you need in a whole week, something you don't need really. But people are cracking that open first thing in the morning and drinking that. And it's not because they're probably hungry or thirsty, because if you're really thirsty, you're going to go for the water. But because you want that boost, you want that addiction, to get satisfied. You're addicted to sugar, Then on top of that, you're probably going for a cup of coffee. Then for breakfast, you're eating a donut, something greasy, and it doesn't change at lunch or dinner. And then all you're doing is sitting in a sedentary position all day. And a lot of people wonder why they're so obese. They'll see fitness influencers online, or they'll see people walking around in public and they have some type of jealousy or envy towards them. But the reason that you look the way you are is because of your own bad choices. And see, what people don't realize, especially if you look at a lot of my videos, is that I didn't just look like that overnight. I had to put in some hard work, pushing myself to the limit, pushing myself to the point where I'm like, oh man, if I do this, I might end up passing out. Is this a good decision right now to be working out? And I'm not saying that that's the point that anyone needs to get to, if you feel your well-being is in jeopardy, that you continue to work out to that extent. But like I said, I know my limit. I know what I can do. I know what I have to do before I need to stop. And so when you see me on these videos doing all of these, pull-ups, push-ups, running for 15 miles, that took years on top of years to train myself to do. That didn't just happen overnight. I've been running since I don't know how old, since I was a kid. I've always been running in some capacity. So this is nothing that just happened overnight. And a lot of people becoming obese and getting these chronic illnesses, that's nothing that happened overnight either. You know, unfortunately, some of our own parents weren't educated enough, and we were raised on these bad diets, these unhealthy foods, you know. And I'm from Charleston, South Carolina, you know. So I grew up in a situation of where, you know, dinner was cooked religiously every night. Breakfast was cooked religiously every morning. And it wasn't always the most healthiest of choices. You know, it's mostly something fried, you know, seasoned with ham, you know, high, butter content, high sugar content, high salt content. It wasn't always healthy. But fortunately, I don't know, something in my soul always knew that I wanted to be active. You know, I love being, physically engaged with things. So I always had that, you know, yearning to do something athletic. I don't know where it came from. Maybe it's something down, in my genetics, or maybe it's something one of my ancestors, were into, possibly, you know. But for people that aren't like that, you can still train yourself. You can train yourself to understand at a certain age that these foods that I'm eating, they have a negative impact on me, and I can train myself. I can do the research. I can educate myself as to what I need to do to change my life, because at a certain point, it's going to be up to you. You can't blame your parents anymore for feeding you bad food. You can't blame that boyfriend or girlfriend, bringing home, junk food, and well, they bring it in the house, so I'm just going to eat it. You can't blame people after a certain point. All the responsibility is on you. And unfortunately, a lot of us as humans, we can't see long term enough to understand how our decisions will impact us. People don't see that if I keep eating the way I'm eating, this high sodium, these sugary drinks, that's going to lead to hypertension one day, diabetes, and that's probably what's going to be listed on my death certificate as the cause of death. Unfortunately, we're not trained probably to see that long term, But like I said, with the amount of information out here and education that we can pursue, it's getting to the point where there's no excuse. I'm just seeing too many people that's almost ending up on their deathbed because of unhealthy choices all of their lives. The same thing that you did at 15, 16, or as a young adult, you can't do that same thing, once you hit your late 30s and going onward. It's going to have a different effect on your body. Like I notice with kids, they can eat all of this junk, and a lot of kids, they don't gain any type of weight from it. Their metabolism is so much quicker, faster. They're able to burn off that energy because they don't stop moving. But as we get older, we naturally slow down, so we can't make those same decisions. And that's not even to say that if our kids do partake, or we give our kids those certain foods, that they need to continue eating like that, because like I said, that's eventually going to have a long-term effect on them, especially if they're physically inactive. So I guess the point of this talk was just to kind of, blow off some steam, get a point across, just kind of let people know you're going to have to wake up and change your life. You're going to have to really understand the benefit certain foods have, and the negative effects these processed foods have on our bodies as well. All of these additives and these chemicals, I know a lot of people are looking for, we live in such a jacked up society, I think, to where people are always looking for a short-term fix. They don't care how long the fix lasts, as long as it can get them out of that temporary, depression, or point of being bored, or not to think about the situation that they're in. Instead of focusing on making the situation better, why not just run to that Snicker bar that's going to give me a sugar boost, and it's going to release those feel good chemicals and make me temporarily forget about what's going on. That's what a lot of people are doing. And yeah, that may work for a few minutes or an hour or whatsoever, But all you're going to do is crash right back to the point. You still have to deal with that depression. You're going to have to deal with the person you are. You know, the food is only going to be a temporary fix. The unhealthy foods, it's only going to be a temporary fix. It's not, but it's going to have a negative long-term effect on you. Like I said, do you want a lot of people, and because I've worked in the medical field, you know, just about all of my adult life. So a lot of the things I see listed on people's death certificate is due to the choices they made all of their lives. So the point I'm trying to make is that if you're going to continue making bad, unhealthy choices, why not just have it to where, oh, this person died of food because they decided to keep eating Snicker bars. You know, they kept deciding to crack open Cokes every morning. They decided to eat, you know, unhealthy, salty, high sugar content foods all their lives. Why don't we just list that on the death certificate? If you wouldn't want that listed on your death certificate, then why make those choices, you know, at all? You know, yeah, there's natural causes. You know, we all pass away from that, but don't let it be issues that you could fix yourself. So, you know, everyone just make better choices. I want to see everyone healthy. You know, I'm not just concerned about my well-being. I think humanity as a whole has to come up and hold each other accountable. So just take that information in good stride and, you know, continue on your fitness journey and make healthy decisions. Peace.